Olivia Lewis from Bridge Detroit and Kat Stafford from the Associated Press. Thank you so much for joining us. The country is reeling right now from the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we can also say that 2020 has been a year. How you doing? How you doing, Kat?
That's a big question. I just think back to several months ago when you would ask someone how they're doing. It's a simple answer. But now, there's so much going on. We've lost so many people. You just mentioned our justice that just died. It's just been an incredible year of loss and change, I think, for all of us. So I'm handling it, I think, as best as anyone could.
Good. I'm happy to hear it. Olivia, how you doing?
I think same as Kat. I think I'm just taking it day by day. Like every day you just get up and say, okay, like it's a new day. What can I get the most out of today? How can I overcome or how can I be at peace today? So
yeah,
one day at a time.
One day at a time is certain. It's certainly, the mantra that a lot of us are choosing to employ at this, difficult time. The murder of George Floyd has reverberated in cities all over the nation, including Detroit. How do you feel about the coverage of perhaps the largest modern civil rights movement is being covered by media organizations in the city and around the United States? Kat, we'll start with you.
I kind of compare it to every time a crisis hits America. If you look at our coverage of Hurricane Katrina, if you look at the coverage around Trayvon Martin and so many other deaths that have come before, whenever you talk about the media writ large and coverage, there are always obvious gaps and holes in coverage. And I believe that's a reflection because of the newsrooms not having the right people in there to add the proper nuance, to add the proper coverage that is needed to really explain to readers what's happening. And so when you ask me, how do I feel about the coverage of George Floyd? I feel the same way that I felt in previous years, where I feel that there's a lot of great coverage. There is a lot of nuanced coverage that I am seeing, but I feel that we can always do more and do better.
Yeah, Olivia, you're covering protests and, following this story closely here in the city of Detroit. How do you feel about the media's coverage of this, civil rights movement, this Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests that have ensued in cities across the nation, including our city?
Right. So, when I think of all of the protests that are happening, not just here in Detroit, but everywhere, the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013. Yeah. So when we think back to that time, there were reports going out in 2013 that were asking if Black Lives Matter was a terrorist organization, which is crazy. And so now, and there's still reports that are going out with that question. And it's like, when we think about the words that we're writing or the words that we're saying on podcasts or TV or whatever, radio, like those words have meaning. And so it affects the way that the community sees the protest, how it's happening, the people who are involved. And so when we're asking questions like, oh, well, has there been any looting? Or has there been, how many people have been arrested? Those questions matter. And so we have to think about our reporting in terms of how is this affecting the community? What is the community doing to either be involved or what are their feelings about the protest? And so I think that there's been a lot of reporting in terms of like, there's been a lot of change in the way that protests have been covered, but it's still being covered like from the forefront in terms of like a crime story, which I think is very troubling.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to see that there have been some changes. Like I think it was on NPR, there was like a stance about like how headlines should say a Black man was shot and killed and murdered instead of an unarmed Black man, and just the difference that makes in terms of the reader and understanding the issue. But locally, those little things make such a huge difference. And so I think Bridge Detroit has done a really great job in terms of looking at what the community is doing, how the community is acting, and reporting those stories.
And, I guess cementing how important it is to have newsrooms that are reflective of, you know, the makeup of the cities that they are covering, to add that layer of nuance that non-reporters of color or journalists of color will miss because they just have a different experience, right, Kat?
Absolutely. And just thinking about the city of Detroit, using that as an example, if you are from the city, if you know the neighborhoods, you know the power players, you know who the grandma is on that street, you know the right people to interview, you know the right questions to ask. You have that perspective that's really ingrained in you to know what's going on in the neighborhood. You're not just what I call parachuting in to get a story and then leaving. You're invested in the community. And in my opinion, that is something that every newsroom should hope for, not even just local news. You know, now I'm on a national level, and it's like, how do you bring that perspective into national coverage? And it's by still amplifying those voices, still finding the right context and the right people to talk to. So even thinking about, who am I interviewing in these stories? And if you are not using the right voices in your stories, that's a problem. That's why we're going to continue to have this coverage that feels like it's just scratching at the surface and not getting at the underlying issues.
That makes so much sense. Let's talk about facts versus the narrative that we hear from the president and other spaces of power, right? Does that narrative line up with what you know is happening on the ground?
I think a lot about how President Trump lately has really kind of stuck to this law and order narrative that he wants to restore law and order in communities across the country. And what we know what that's doing is that's signaling, he's trying to signal to a certain base. He's trying to signal to these this narrative of the white suburban mom who he believes that they don't want to see crime come into their neighborhoods. And that's how, as Olivia stated, that's how he is painting the picture of the movement for Black lives. But what we know is on the other side, they're saying we're not out here trying to destroy neighborhoods. We are literally fighting for our lives. So I think as reporters, it's on us to provide that. Once again, nuance is my favorite word lately, to share facts. And the facts are that there are people protesting in these streets because they are tired of seeing Black men die at the hands of police. They are tired of seeing police brutality. They are tired of seeing people of color die disproportionately from COVID-19, right? It's not even just about police protests. And so how do you cover that?
Yeah, Olivia, we've been paying close attention to the narrative that has been cascading here in the city of Detroit from the mayor and the chief of police, as well as the president. Does it line up with what you know is happening on the ground and in the streets of the city of Detroit?
Not at all. Just not at all. It's actually really frustrating, especially because, and I can go back to Bryce Huffman's piece on Operation Legend, because the entire, when news broke that the FBI was going to send federal agents here to Detroit, it was really confusing to people on the ground and said, wait, I thought these protests were predominantly peaceful. I thought that people were, really coming together. And now it's like, wait, now we're sending in federal agents. What does this have to do with the protests? And so I think it caused a lot of confusion around what was actually happening here, and really I feel like it was the federal government's way of like trying to take over the narrative and say, well, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to react. And even though it ended up not being about the protests, it was like very confusing and an unsettling time when it didn't have to be.
Yeah, especially with how it was timed, with what was happening here in the city of Detroit. It was a time of uncertainty, but definitely a time of fear, I would say. I want to ask you both about what, the layers that exist in being Black women and journalists covering Black Lives Matter. What's going on with you, Olivia, internally as a Black person, as a Black woman, as a journalist who is expected to put words to an experience that people are feeling and going through, but that you're also going through at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Honestly, I feel very fortunate because I work for Bridge Detroit. So like back to your earlier statement about being in a newsroom that also represents the community that we're covering. I think that is so tremendously helpful just for my own sanity and my own peace, that I know that I can rely on my team, and that if I have questions, like, you guys are going to be there for me, or if I am doubting myself or the things that I'm doing, like, I can always go back to my team. And I didn't always feel like that in other newsrooms. And so I feel like that's a huge part of it. But also, like, I feel very invested in the stories that we're telling, that, you know, I really want to tell stories that reflect the community or are answering the community's questions. Like, it's not just about saying, okay, there was a protest today, this many people got arrested, or this many people didn't get arrested. You know, it's more than that. It's like Kat said, when you think about the neighborhoods, you know, who are the people involved, what's going on in the neighborhood, and how is the protest impacting them, or how are they getting involved in the protest? Like, all of that matters. And so I feel very invested in the stories that we're telling.
Kat, talk about those layers of being a Black woman who is a journalist, who has to put words to an experience that it's not only happening to people, but it's also happening to you, the same level of trauma, the same level of anxiety. What's that? Say more about that for us.
Well, these past several months have forced me to rethink journalism and how I approach my own reporting, because I've just been kind of in my head trying to explain, what does being objective mean? You know, when you're in journalism school, all they talk about is the notion of objectivity. But what I've really thought about over the past several months is the fact that I am a Black woman first, and I am also a journalist. And I believe that my experiences in America, my experiences in Detroit, inform my reporting. It's not a hindrance. And the goal for me as a journalist is to work in a newsroom that allows me to bring my full self into my work to, again, help inform that reporting. So as I've been watching everything unfold, I feel that as a journalist, I have to get it right. And I think about that every day, because the things that we write, the things that we report, it impacts people. It shapes the thought process of people in Detroit and beyond. So I think it's an honor to tell our stories, and I take it so seriously because I know that journalism really does have an impact on people's lives.
Yeah, like, everybody is a culmination of their experience and are coming from various places, right? And so I want to just dig in for a second about this journalistic standard of objectivity. How do you feel that standard is shifting and being challenged today? And who does objectivity really benefit, and who does it oppress, Olivia?
Oh gosh, I mean, the question of objectivity, I appreciate a level of the facts and just like, this is what happened, but also I can't show up to a scene, or I can't show up to a place and pretend that I'm not Black. Like, it is very obvious who I am. Like, it's never going to go away. And so when I'm asking questions and when people are talking to me, I think it adds to just the level of just honesty and like being able to connect with people and knowing that we have similar and shared experiences. And so I think objectivity, I don't want to say I'm tossing it out the window, but for some things, there just needs to be like a human level of connection that I don't think is always present in stories, when the focus is like, oh, we're just going to be objective and just tell the story. Like, there's more to it. There's always more to the story, and like getting those personal feelings is important.
Yeah, and I think it's a relatively new standard that came in the 20th century. And, just in my experience, objectivity is used to police Black experience and perhaps Black descent to the benefit of the white heteronormative power structure, right? So is that really objective? Who are we really trying to appeal to, Kat? We talk about, we need to be objective, and we need to make sure that we present both sides, regardless of whether both sides are factual or truthful, right?
Yeah, and you know, the New York Times had a really great column that Wesley Lowery wrote about this whole notion of objectivity, and I believe, I don't want to misquote him, but I'll paraphrase. He said something to the effect that this notion of objectivity was created through a white gaze. It is the notion that white is norm, is the norm of this country, and that's what we should subscribe to. And when you are a Black journalist, when you are a journalist of color in the newsroom, and you see stuff a different way, that's just not true. So for me, I've tried to take a fact-based approach with my reporting. I report the facts. And is racism a two-sided issue? That's what I said to someone. So do you see racism as a two-sided issue? It shouldn't be. Racism is bad, right? But if you subscribe to the normality of objectivity, then you need to report this whole notion of both sides. So I think that we need to rethink, what does that mean? Who are our audiences? And if you start to peel back the layers, you will see that we have not been serving Black communities. We have not been serving communities of color well at all because of this notion of objectivity.
Wow. My last question is about, we've seen reports of journalists being gassed, mistaken as activists, and even being arrested. We've even had those reports here in the city of Detroit. What happens when journalists become part of the story, Olivia?
Yeah, I think that is so important. And it just goes back to how you can't be completely objective in a story like this when you're covering a protest and then you end up being someone who's hurt during this protest. Like, you become part of the story because your Blackness is never going to go away. And so I feel like I'm not being very eloquent about this, but I just feel like that feeds into this whole thing of the being objective in your story. Like, you can't be. You become part of it because it is attached to who you are, and you can't ignore it. They're not going to ignore it. So, like, tell stories from a personal standpoint because you're going to end up being a part of the story.
Kat, any thoughts about this when journalists become part of the story?
You know, I think back to someone like Ida B. Wells, who is just like someone that I aspire to be. You know, I know I can't quite touch the impact that she had, but what if we told someone like her to be objective while she was covering the lynchings of Black people across the country, right? It just doesn't make sense. And so as we are covering these protests, as you are seeing people get beat or assaulted by police, how do you cover that? I think you have to be able to tell what's happening. You can't shy away from the fact that there is a problem with this criminal justice system. There is an issue with policing in America. And to say that does not mean that you are biased, but you are stating a fact. And so I am personally enjoying seeing this whole industry go through this reckoning because I think it's overdue.
Yeah. Olivia Lewis from Bridge Detroit and Katrease Stafford from the Associated Press, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.